What's going on, everybody? So today I got a fun video for you all. We're going to be ranking all 18 leaders in Star Wars Unlimited on a tier list today. Now, this is going to be focused around the premier 50 card constructed format, not Twin Suns, not draft, not sealed, all of which would be drastically different from the 50 card premier format. You're looking at, drafted sealed, where you can't take advantage of potentially the strengths or shore up the weaknesses of certain leaders because of the randomness of the cards. You might be priced into playing a certain color that doesn't pair well with your leader, etc. Twin Suns, much more random, also potentially, a little bit multiplayer, and so that changes things up as well. This is going to be the 1v1 consistent, 50 card deck. Of course, you could do more than that, but that's what we're focusing on today. The most competitive, I guess you could say, format that the game has to offer. Now, with that, let's talk about the tiers before we start rating some of our leaders. So S tier, this is going to be the tier that either just gives you such an insurmountable advantage that almost just wins you the game on their action ability alone, or their, on attack or on play or whatever it is that they have. And this is what really makes the deck. Like, people are playing this deck, and the only way this deck performs as well as it does is because you have this leader. To be honest, there's only one of the cards here that fits in this list. A tier is going to be, okay, I have a very, very nice group of cards. These are some of the stronger cards in the format, and I can leverage their power or make them stronger based on whatever leader I'm running, or potentially take advantage of a strategy that may not otherwise be there. B tier leaders are going to be leaders that, well, either have inconsistent but very powerful plays, or, well, consistently above average plays, right? Maybe you're leveraging something that's reasonably strong but not quite as strong as the A tier, or maybe you could do something ridiculous but you can't do it all the time. And I think some of the leaders fall more into this category than others. C tier, these are the leaders that, well, it's really hard to take advantage of potentially their ability, or maybe their ability just isn't really that great and constructed because you don't have, I don't know, maybe not enough units on the board, or you don't have a slower format, or maybe what you're doing is way too, niche or something like that. And then D tier is, at this current moment, I don't see a reason why you would play this leader, because either their deck just doesn't work right now because there's not enough cards, or it just doesn't synergize well with the cards that we currently have. So with that said, let's start with the S tier. And I think no one is surprised here. I'm going to put Boba Fett in his own tier as of right now. I might change it as we go deeper, but to be honest, I think there is a clear difference between Boba Fett and every other leader in the game. The reason being is his action ability is what solely puts you in a place where you want to play yellow and villainy, because you just want to leverage Boba Fett as a leader, right? I wouldn't say the cunning villainy cards are particularly stronger. In fact, I would argue that a lot of the vigilance villainy, the aggression villainy, and your command villainy cards are oftentimes just higher power level. But the ability to play multiple of the cunning villainy cards with Boba Fett's action ability, and the ability to extremely blow out your opponent, just the amount of tempo that you can gain through these certain spells that you have access to because you have that extra resources, this is what puts Boba in the S tier. And I do think that he is a step above every single other leader on this list. Even what I would consider the best decks, like number 2 and number 3, are a decent chunk worse than Boba. They might end up in S tier. We'll see if I have to shuffle things around, and maybe there's too many A tiers or B tiers as we go through, or maybe I'll have to reevaluate the list at the end. But I think Boba Fett is a clear favorite. Let's start with Cassian next up. I'm gonna have to put Cassian starting into the C tier category. So the problem with Cassian right now is that drawing additional cards is not really much of a payoff to pay resources, as well as to have that on an action ability for your leader. The initiative disadvantage, as well as the resource disadvantage in order to draw those additional cards for your action ability, as well as, maybe getting some free cards on attack, is pretty mediocre. Add to that, his stats are, well, not like as great as a lot of other leaders, and he just doesn't do anything to really impact the board. Ends up in C tier. When we get a card that potentially benefits you, or maybe some way to leverage the additional card income that you're getting from Cassian, I could see him bumping up to maybe B tier or A tier, or maybe even S tier. Of course, that can apply to really any leader here, but I think Cassian in specific. Next up, we have Chewie, and I think Chewie solidly gets placed into the B tier. I think that he's kind of like a middle of the pack leader, someone that, you know, doesn't really look too dangerous when you first look at him, because he's a 7 cost leader, right? You're like, okay, he's going to come down very late. But when he does come down, he is a brick wall that you do need to deal with, and potentially will trade with multiple of your cards while you're doing so. Very strong defensive leader. I think the thing that makes him really, really kind of average, as we're talking about here, is that he just doesn't really do anything insane with his action ability. You can action out a lot of cards that may not have Sentinel otherwise and disrupt some aggro opponents, which is kind of nice. But outside of that, I don't really find Chewie to be all that powerful oftentimes. And well, the only thing that's really going for him is the fact that he is a fat creature when he comes down. Next up, we have Chirrut, and I've been very impressed with Chirrut. Now, I'll say this, the biggest thing that Chirrut has going for him, out of anything that you can talk about, colors, you know, stats, ability, is the fact that he is the cheapest Force affinity or Force tagged leader in the game. This allows you to benefit from things like It Binds All Things, you know, Jedi Lightsaber, or anything that benefits from having a Force unit. You know, we have like Force Lightning, Force Choke, like anything like that. All those cards get immediately better when you can deploy them 1 turn earlier, guaranteed, based on your leader, who's a free character, right? So you play your leader, Chirrut in this case, he is not going to die at least that turn, so you can at least benefit from all those Force cards, and they are very powerful. The downside to them is that they're not consistent, but with a leader that you're guaranteed to play on turn, you know, 4 if you want to, these become some of the most powerful cards in the game. Add to that things like your upgrades and things get immensely better because of his, you know, ability to not be defeated until the end of the phase. Maybe you could heal him up or something like that. Add to all of that the fact that, well, he's just a kind of reasonably statted, reasonably buffed up card that can come down much earlier than a lot of the other leaders that we're seeing here, which is kind of nice. Next one up, we have Darth Vader. And, well, I'm going to have to put Darth Vader slightly ahead of Chirrut. For the same reasons that Force cards are strong with Chirrut, they are also strong with Darth Vader. Darth Vader also has access to one of the more powerful upgrades in his own lightsaber, allowing you to have a removal spell, which also pumps him up, making him a very strong threat. But the ability to come down, immediately potentially kill 2 different units with his on-attack trigger, or just start smacking base and dealing damage to the opponent's units while you are doing so is really, really powerful. And then, of course, well, we didn't really talk too much about Chirrut's action because it's just a small toughness increase that isn't super relevant oftentimes. Darth Vader's action ability is actually extremely powerful, right? Doing 1 damage to a base and 1 damage to a unit can oftentimes prevent trade ups from your opponent, as well as just getting that little bit of extra, you know, chip damage as you're going through the game. It deals with a lot of things like potentially a wing leader, a early TIE fighter, or anything that has 1 toughness, an enemy stormtrooper, an enemy Greedo. You can just knock those out with your action ability, as long as you have the ability to, you know, action out some things. So really, really strong there, and allows you to leverage potentially a little bit of unspent resources that maybe some other leaders are dealing with. Very, very strong. I would put him solidly in the A tier. Han Solo. I'm going to put Han Solo at the top of B tier. So Han Solo is one of those cards, and you might even be able to argue in the A tier, depending on what you want to do. I've built Han 2 different ways. You have the Casino Han, you know, leverage all the 7 drops that you can. Very, very powerful. Trying to, you know, get Han out early, you know, on maybe you potentially play Han Green and you're ramping with, if you wanted to try to play resupplies and such. But let's say you're not doing any of that and you're just leveraging his action ability, right? Turn 4, you got 5 resources. You action down a resource, you get 6. You play Han, or you ready up Han, you attack, you have 7 resources. On turn 4, you're able to go ahead and play your 7 drop. Oftentimes U-Wing, Mace Windu, you have Luke, you have basically any of the 7 drops that you're playing in the deck, right? The problem with that is a very inconsistent way of playing, right? It forces you to, well, have that specific 7 drop on time, right? If you draw them on turn 1 or turn 2, it might be that you're resourcing them to try to play your other cheaper cards. If you draw all 7 drops, it could be a pretty bad situation. You oftentimes can have to mulligan with this deck. It's probably the biggest mulligan simulator out of any of the leaders here. But it's not so inconsistent that it's not going to work and it's always going to lose you the game. Being able to play a 7 drop on turn 4 is very powerful, and that's oftentimes what causes Han to win. There's also the other style of deck, which I've started to play a little bit, just playing off curve, playing a Han aggro deck. The only problem with this deck, while you're able to leverage that action ability and leverage the additional card that you draw each turn, you very quickly run out of cards, even though you're able to play a 3 drop on turn 1 like a Millennium Falcon, which is ridiculous. You don't have access to both red and green, which is the strongest rebel aggro colors. And then couple that with the fact that you're not able to use the action ability every single turn, and you don't really get to take initiative because you're always using that action, puts him solidly into the top of B tier for me. Our only D tier leader, as far as I think right now, it's got to be Hera. So similar to how Boba Fett, is like the must-have, just does something that no one else does. Hera does something that no one else does, and no card in the set really benefits from, right? She allows you to really leverage the fact that you can play all the Spectre units without paying aspect penalties. The problem with that is that not all of them are like absurdly powerful. Like Ezra, Kanan, Chopper, they're all good, don't get me wrong. Zeb as well, Sabine, these are all good cards, but they don't really all mesh well together, right? Like Zeb and Sabine work pretty well together. Arguably Chopper does as well. Kanan kind of wants you to be a little bit more controlling or mid-rangey. It's fine threat, maybe in the aggro mirror. The bigger problem, however, is that, for one, your leader does nothing if you don't draw those cards that are off aspect, right? Let's say you're playing Hera red and you wanted to go the red-green rebel aggro strategy, but you wanted to play like Chopper and you wanted to play Kanan as additional options, right? Well, guess what? If you don't draw Kanan or you don't draw Chopper, you're getting nothing from your leader until you actually play her. And even when you do, you only get the benefit from her if you're able to attack with a unique unit on the battlefield. So for me, this is a like card that they're releasing, and it's much more of a speculative pick, right? Maybe in a couple of sets from now we have like another 3, 4, 6, 8, 2,000 cards when you have potentially the ability to add additional Spectre units, or like maybe you just add like the Spectre tag to certain characters like Ahsoka Fulcrum or something like that, or maybe you add like Captain Rex and add him as part of the squad or something like that she's able to benefit from others. But as for right now, or maybe you just get extra Ezra versions or Kanan versions, you're just able to play a full Phoenix deck. That's when we're looking at something interesting. Or I mean, heck, the Phantom 2, right? Like, they could add Phantom 2, for example. There's just so many options you have, and we just need more cards for it. Iden, definitely an A tier deck here. And as I'm looking at this, I'm gonna have to drop down someone from the A tier already. But I do think Iden is one of the better decks, and I would very similarly, and I'm actually gonna put Krennic up here as well. I actually think these two are very similar, as I'm going to talk about them both. Both of them kind of do what you want out of your more controlling lists, but they have a similar build to them, right? You could either go vigilance, villainy, aggression, or you can go vigilance, command, aggression. Both decks, again, play very similarly. Iden in particular tends to skew a little bit more removal focused, whereas Krennic skews just slightly more unit focused in order to leverage their respective abilities. But both of them tend to play a little bit more mid-range / control games in order to leverage those abilities, because, well, Iden's only does stuff when you kill things, right? Or you're able to remove things from the battlefield. But that ability oftentimes puts you out of range from lethal from your aggro opponents, which is a very common matchup. Add to that the fact that you can play a little bit more higher end stuff and outvalue things like Boba potentially, or just live long enough to be able to actually, play out all your spells. This puts you in a decent position against, well, a lot of the better decks. And the same thing goes for Krennic. In fact, Krennic, because he's got the restore on his attack, well, you can actually have the option for him to potentially trade off with some creatures, make him a 3-powered creature, and then start restoring some HP while also getting value from your other creatures, especially things like Death Trooper, for example, which is a 3-mana 4/1 now with Krennic's ability, or like, Scout Bite Pursuer. The grit cards are all very, very strong. These are very similar to me, and I would actually put Krennic solidly in the A tier, maybe below Darth Vader. But I do think they are very, very similar in play style. Next up, we have IG-88, and IG-88's okay. The issue with IG-88 is the fact that we have multiple other leaders that I think leverage the aggro ability much, much better, right? On the front side, you have a decent action. You can use it every turn, but it's not always going to do anything. So it's pretty inconsistent, especially against like the aggro matchups, right? Because if you're trying to leverage IG's ability, let's say you have the initiative on turn 1. You play a unit. Okay, they play a unit, you take initiative. You go to turn 2, you have to play a unit before you attack in order for you to get your bonus on your action. But then if they play a unit, guess what? Your action kind of does nothing. And so if you're able to action things, yeah, it's just an extra damage per turn, which is arguably better than Sabine. The issue is that it's wildly inconsistent. And so I would much prefer Sabine's, right? Let's say you're in a control matchup. Well, you don't care about the damage hitting your base. You do care about the extra action use. So that is something to consider. But you're going to be able to get it every turn if you need to. Okay. If you're in the aggro mirror, well, IG's doesn't oftentimes do anything. If you're in the mid-range, grind fest, oftentimes they're trading off with your creatures and potentially playing more than you. So again, IG's doesn't necessarily do anything. And so that's why he ends up in C tier. His backside is actually decent, right? It gives you a sort of like a red 3 ability, right? Boom, flip him up, but he is a 5/4, okay? That makes him very, very weak to a lot of different things on turn 4 and even turn 3, right? Let's say you go turn 3 and you play, or not necessarily turn 3, turn 2, you can play like Echo Base Defender, and you're focused on space over here. You play your IG, and suddenly your IG's trading with their 3-drop Sentinel. You can even play that on turn 4 to prevent IG from really doing anything. The 4 toughness on this guy really hampers his body on the second half, and I'm gonna have to put him in the C tier because of that. Next up, we have Grand Inquisitor, and I've actually been pretty impressed with Grand Inquisitor. I do think Grand Inquisitor actually has a lot of things going for him. Again, similar to Chirrut and similar to Darth Vader, you can leverage the Force tag, which is really, really powerful. But the way you get use out of his ability is by hurting your own units. And so there needs to be very specific units that you're going to use in order to leverage that. And also, his ability is mainly focused towards like aggro / mid-range, causing you to want to be very aggressive in attacking, and it could put you in a position where you're trading off very unfavorably with other creatures, right? Even things like Fifth Brother, or you play like a Scout Bike Pursuer, right? Scout Bike Pursuer with Grand Inquisitor's action is now just a Viper Probe Droid without the looking at the hand, but it's ready on turn 1, which is pretty good. But if you're playing, as I said, Fifth Brother, or maybe you're playing another drop like Inferno 4, for example, you try to ready up your Inferno 4, they play like an Alliance X-Wing, suddenly they can just trade up with their creature into yours, even in the aggro matchup, which can put him in a little bit of a disadvantage. But he has some very powerful options available to him, allowing you to constantly get in some more and more damage, which is very powerful. It's just a matter of, depending on the matchup, it could actually be more of a downside than upside hitting your own creatures, right? In the control matchups, if they have like takedowns or make an opening, right? Suddenly you're readying up your scout bike pursuer or whatever, or maybe it's the seventh sister, and suddenly, ooh, now I can use my removal spell that wasn't viable before, or I could attack into my creature which wasn't viable before, and that could make it a little bit awkward, especially with things like Death Trooper. My goodness, is Death Trooper good against the Grand Inquisitor decks. So just something to remember. On the backside, again, a little bit less punishing, but still something that you do need to place well in order for you to get some value out of him. He's also just a 3-powered leader, which is a little bit on the weaker side, but still quite strong overall. I think he ends up solidly into the B tier. Next up, we have Jin, and honestly, I'm gonna have to put Jin slightly above Cassian, but also in the C tier. One of the big things with Jin is, well, it's all about attacking, but trading off with units. And so she kind of wants to fit in a control deck, but she runs yellow, and yellow as a base is kind of poor in order for you to have to pair with, well, maybe you're pairing with green or red or blue. It's just kind of a weak color combination for that strategy. You could go more mid-rangey, start trading off with creatures and play a more aggro / mid-rangey deck. But again, you're in pretty poor colors to be able to do so when you have other rebel options or heroism options that are just oftentimes better. And the key is that you need to be able to hit other creatures to benefit from her action or even her backside, right? She is 6 to play. 4/7's a respectable body, but the problem is that, again, she doesn't do anything other than just be a respectable unit if you don't have any creatures to hit. And that ends up being her biggest downside, especially in constructed, where maybe your creatures are getting bounced every turn, or maybe your creatures aren't necessarily even going to trade well into your opponent's creatures. All of that, oftentimes will not be the case, because your opponent will just probably attack them first before they could actually leverage that action, or you're playing a control deck which doesn't have as many creatures to leverage her action ability. All of these things are oftentimes issues for Jin and ends up in the C tier. Leia, Leia's an immediate A tier for me. I think Leia is extremely powerful. I'm actually going to drop Chirrut down to the B tier, seeing as we actually are getting pretty high at the A tier. And I do think everything I said about Chirrut is true. Just based on the leaders that we have here, I want to kind of separate the power level difference. But Leia, I think Leia, alongside Sabine, depending on the matchups, are like number 2 decks in the format. And you know what? I will put Sabine up here with Leia as well. So these 3 leaders here, Iden, Sabine, and Leia, are kind of vying for number 2 deck in the meta right now. I think there's a clear difference between Boba, Leia, Sabine, and Iden, but I think that all 3 of these have very, very interesting matchups against each other. Let's talk about Leia first, because I have Leia rated slightly higher than Sabine. It did show in the last tournament, but also in my personal experience, I found Leia to be a little bit stronger than Sabine. The main reason for that is one of the best advantages you can do while you're playing an aggro deck is just to be able to do things first. Able to get in damage before your opponent can remove your creature. That's one of the most powerful things, right? And Leia allows you to do that more often than not by action cheating out your attacks with Leia herself, right? This is really, really strong. Now, when you're considering Leia, you're really focused on making a full-on rebel deck. And you're also priced into playing green as your main color, which means that you're probably just playing red. Green, red, Leia, that is just like kind of what your options are. When you consider Sabine and you compare Sabine to Leia, there are a few big differences. One of the biggest ones is that your action ability isn't dependent on having creatures on the battlefield. Now, while I mentioned earlier about Jin or IG where it's not always going to be applicable, Leia, on the other hand, is kind of similar in that way. However, her body on the other half is far stronger, coming down a little bit earlier than Jin, being much more higher toughness, and again allowing you to action cheat with her. And so this is what puts her in the A tier for me. And Sabine, quite similarly, she has something that no other leader has, in that she comes down a turn earlier than the earliest other leaders can, as a 4-costed leader. Also, a very respectable body on top of that. These two things, coupled with her option to just guarantee additional damage with her action, is really, really strong. It's kind of interesting because when you're playing Leia, your goal is to action cheat, take initiative, and really blow out your opponent that way. When you're playing Sabine, it's the opposite. You oftentimes are sacrificing initiative or trying to get additional damage with your action, but you're playing on the back foot oftentimes for that little bit of extra damage if you choose to go for it. As well as, well, on turn 3, basically always, you're oftentimes, I should say, going to be behind in terms of initiative because you're readying up Sabine and attacking with it. Well, your opponent probably isn't going to be doing all that much more than, the basics. So pretty interesting comparison. I do think there are times when Sabine's a little bit better. I do think there are times when Leia is a little bit better. I personally value Leia a little bit more against things like Boba, which is interesting, at least as far as I found. But depending on how you build them, and they're very similar, as well as Sabine potentially able to go like yellow, red Sabine. There are some things that are cool that you can do with both leaders that I think are very viable and ends up in the A tier. Next up, we have Luke, and I do think Luke probably gets placed in the B tier. So here's what's interesting about Luke. I actually viewed this guy a little bit better than, well, I initially have him here because of his extremely powerful ability to place shield counters on rebel allies. That is a very powerful ability, and you can leverage some really powerful turns due to it. Here's the biggest issue. He is in blue. If this was in something like red or green, and you were able to play a very similar list to Sabine and Leia, and maybe leverage a more mid-range style with the similar colors, I think this would be arguably a better deck, because there are a lot of turns with Sabine and Leia where you can leverage that additional mana. You're playing rebels already, that's what the decks are, and the shield counters are not negligible. These are all very strong things. With blue being your main color, it automatically puts you into a mid-range / control pile oftentimes. There aren't nearly as many strong aggro cards in blue as there are in green or in red. And the problem with that is that, well, you aren't leveraging the shield counter early enough in order for you to actually benefit from it. Your creatures or your units oftentimes get outclassed. You go turn 1, maybe you're playing Restored Arc 170, and they go turn 1 Battlefield Marine. Okay, cool. Maybe if they attack first, you have the same life point swing in terms of 3 one way, 3 the other. But guess what? They just outstatted your creature as a 3/3 and a 2/3 in space. Granted, they're not going to be trading with it, but unless you're going to play green as your other color, you can't be playing that Battlefield Marine. And if you are playing green, guess what? You're not playing red to leverage things like Sabine or things of that nature. And so that is a little disappointing to me. And so he ends up in B tier, just being a very consistent, solid leader that gives you a lot of value. Also a force leader, and I think that's the most powerful thing about Luke, able to leverage Luke's lightsaber and the Jedi lightsaber later on in the game. And that's what makes him powerful. Oftentimes a little bit weaker than Darth Vader, and so I think he ends up in the top of B tier. Next up, we have Emperor Palpatine. I don't think he's quite weak enough to be placed in the C tier, but I don't think he's strong enough to be placed higher than the lower end of B tier. There's a few reasons for this. Let's talk about his action ability first. So this action ability is such a high cost. It costs you a resource, a unit, and the payoff is ping something and draw a card. You oftentimes aren't able to leverage the drawing a card aspect because not only do you need to play additional units, but you also spend a mana in order to kill it to draw the card. And so the mana constriction is very, very high. Add to that, he's the most expensive resource to deploy at 8 resources. Now here's the I guess you'd say exception or the use case for Emperor Palpatine. He has a very solid matchup against the other bigger decks. And what I mean by that is the controlling decks, the Iden decks, the Krennic decks, the Luke decks. These are the kinds of decks that Emperor Palpatine wants to fight, where you can actually leverage his backside, where you're taking control of something that actually is meaningful, and you're able to leverage the 410 body and the fact that you can actually draw extra cards and not be super behind on board. These are what make Emperor Palpatine strong. His flip side is one of the stronger board impacting flips in the game, right? Being able to just take control of a unit that's slightly damaged, like a Cargo Juggernaut or a Luke Skywalker or, you know, a Count Dooku or whatever it is. Anything, really. If any creature, just taking control. It's a removal spell that also gives you something. So it's like a two removal spell, essentially, in a lot of cases. That's just super powerful. But you need to be able to get that to that point. If you're deploying this guy on turn 7, the game's over, okay? Against most decks, okay? Even like the Boba decks. Or I shouldn't say even the Boba decks, like even the Han decks or the Chirrut decks or the Grand Inquisitor decks, the more aggro mid-range decks, they're going to finish you off by then, okay? Don't even get me started on Sabine and Leia. Let's say you're resupplying and you're super laser technicianing, so you're getting him down by turn 5, okay? That's still probably too late against the aggro decks. And against the more mid-rangey decks, yeah, he can come down, but have you done enough to set up for his flip side? If you haven't, then it's going to be pretty mediocre. If you have, then, well, hopefully it's good enough, okay? It may not be at that point. You do get to leverage Emperor's Royal Guard, which is a very powerful 3-drop. A 3/5 is something that's very overstated for this game and potentially has Sentinel, which is pretty cool. But I just don't really see his action being super powerful, and his flip side is too late to come into play. And for that reason, he's going to be at the bottom of B tier, but he does have some powerful turns for sure. Next up, we have Grand Moff Tarkin, and I like this guy at the bottom of A tier. So unlike, you know, Luke Skywalker, who has that one action or one resource action that requires you to play a specific type, just like, you know, Tarkin or Darth Vader even. This one is much more proactive rather than reactive, and he's in a more powerful starting color, both of which you're able to leverage, okay? And he comes down a full turn earlier with a very similar statted body, allowing you to pump all of those Imperials that you're playing. I think the best way to play Tarkin is oftentimes in more of an aggro mid-range list, rather than, you know, maybe a more mid-range or a mid-range controlling list. You can leverage things like Overwhelming Barrage much easier, or even like the 1-mana costed creatures that you have. They just become absurdly powerful, right? If you're playing Tarkin Red, suddenly you have a Stormtrooper that's a 4/2 on turn 2, or a TIE Fighter that's a 3/2 on turn 2. Both of them are very strong, okay? And if you ever play a little bit off curve, you can use that additional mana. And when you do deploy them, these extra experience counters can go a long way into giving you a big win on your attack. So I very much have been impressed with Tarkin. I actually thought he was going to be one of the less used leaders, but his leader ability and his action ability, both very, very strong. It's just, well, a little bit slower than some of the other ones we've seen above him. If you are trying to leverage Tarkin, I will say I oftentimes just like playing Darth Vader a little bit more than Tarkin. You're going to play a lot of the same cards, and I think Darth Vader is a better payoff than Tarkin is, right? The extra damage to base and peeing things down can be very, very, very annoying against certain decks. So something to consider. Lastly, we have Thrawn. Thrawn is going to go into the C tier. And that pains me the most because Thrawn is by far my favorite character on this list. But the Thrawn gameplay is just so mediocre at the current moment. He has one of the best backside bodies in the game, right? A 3/9 at 6 is very powerful, okay? He's just very tanky, allows you to soak up a lot of damage and still live. The problem is that his front side, well, it requires resources, and you have to have the RNG go very well for you in order for you to benefit from that. So he's wildly inconsistent, as well as the payoff isn't like absurd. It's not like you pay a man and you're able to do 3 damage to someone or something like that. It's exhausting an enemy unit. And if you're paying a mana to exhaust an enemy unit, that probably means that you're planning on, well, you know, maybe not killing that unit, because why would you exhaust it if you could just kill it? And so you still have to deal with it next turn, and now you're down a mana. Unless you can leverage things like super laser orbit or, you know, bombing run, things like that that can do multiple creatures gone at the same time, the ability to exhaust units isn't like absurdly powerful, especially how RNG is. If he was in a different color, would this be a little bit different? Probably, because the other part of this is that, you know, yellow cunning is oftentimes tempo oriented. And when you're playing a 6-drop that has a 3/9 body, that is action, isn't accelerating you, doing damage or something like that, puts you in a controlling role, well, the advantage of yellow goes way down. It's one of the reasons why Boba is S tier, and a lot of the other yellow leaders that you're seeing on the list are B and below. The reason is, well, yellow's color is very focused on immediate gain for long-term loss. All right, Boba giving you that extra resources, and arguably he doesn't even have a long-term loss, but being able to play all your cards very early, getting that tempo game flowing. Han getting resources out early but defeating them later, so you cost cards for additional resources. Thrawn, you know, paying mana now to temporarily exhaust units. Again, tempo plays. Jin, well, maybe less so tempo oriented, but trading up at the cost of actions for a little bit less power from your enemies, or even the cards themselves. The problem with that is that if you're in a controlling role, the tempo game plan is oftentimes contradictory to that, and that's where Thrawn ends up in a lot of places for me. So he ends up in the C tier. And I think looking at this list overall, this is kind of how I would look at a lot of the leaders. I think there's a clear weakest leader, and I think there's a clear strongest leader. And I think after that, it's kind of like a jumble in the middle where there's quite a few very powerful leaders to leverage. There's quite a few pretty average to above average leaders. And then there's a couple that are more draft / limited oriented in Jin and IG, or just doesn't really have the cards to support it right now in order for you to benefit from their actions so far. Overall, I don't think this is a bad state for the game to be in. Perhaps Hera and Boba are the outliers and they do need to be balanced, Boba in particular, but outside of that, I think the game is in a pretty good state, and I think this is where I would put all the leaders, at least for constructed at the moment. If we were considering draft, I mean, this list would be way different, because I do think there are some leaders that are way higher up and way lower, because you're not going to be able to benefit from a lot of their strengths or weaknesses, or shore up their weaknesses in draft. So thanks for watching, everyone. Let me know what your thoughts in the comment section down below, and I'll see you all for the next one.